At 48 years old, Naomi Prather stood at the edge of a dirt road with everything she owned tied into a single flour sack, and she did not know where she would sleep that night. It was her husband's own brother, Silas Colby, who had put her out calling due a debt she had never signed for, on land she had bled 14 years into 3 months after her husband Thomas was buried in the frost. She left with $41 in coin, a wedding ring she would not sell, and a stubbornness she had inherited from a father who dug wells for a living. With most of that money, she did something the whole town of Solace Creek would repeat for years. As a joke, she paid $18 for 94 starving deer that a bankrupt game park was selling off like scrap because no one else would give the animals even the price of a bullet. Folks called it the saddest, most foolish purchase Wyoming Territory had ever seen. They did not know that within that ragged, thirsting herd was a secret the ground itself had been keeping for 30 years, a secret that would not just save one widow, but would put water back into the mouths of an entire dying town. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Naomi Prather. If you're watching this from a place that has ever felt forgotten or written off by everyone around it, tell us in the comments because this story is for you. Naomi had not been born to hardship, though hardship had shaped nearly every year of her life since. She came into the world in 1,839 inches, the rolling limestone country of southern Missouri, the third daughter of a man named Amos Teague, who was known across 3 counties not for his farming, though he did that too, but for his uncanny gift of finding water where no one else believed water could be. Amos Teague was a dowser, a well digger, a reader of land so quiet and thorough that neighbors said he could stand on a parched hillside and tell you, within a spade's width, where a spring lay sleeping beneath the rock. He never called it magic. He called it listening. He taught Naomi, and only Naomi of his 3 girls, because she was the one who did not fidget, who could crouch beside a hazel switch or a forked willow branch for an hour without complaint, watching the way morning dew gathered thicker in one patch of grass than another, the way certain trees leaned faintly towards some hidden pole, the way the animals first knew where water was, long before any man's instrument confirmed it. The critters don't need a switch, Naomi. Her father used to tell her, crouched beside her on some sun-baked slope. The ground talks to the thirsty first. You just have to be patient enough to watch who's listening. She grew up believing that patience was not a virtue for the weak, but a discipline for the clear-eyed, and that the things overlooked by loud, hurried men were very often the things worth the most. She remembered long into her later years, one particular afternoon when she was perhaps 12, when a neighboring farmer named Hollis Pruitt had come to her father in a fury, certain that Amos Teague had cheated him, because the well her father sank on Pruitt's own land, in a spot Pruitt himself had scorned as the driest, most useless corner of his acreage, had come in stronger and sweeter than any well in the county, while the spot Pruitt had begged for, a low green hollow that looked to any untrained eye like the obvious place for water, had come up bone dry after 3 days of digging. Amos had only smiled and told the furious man that the hollow was green precisely because rain ran off it quickly and never stayed, while the dry-looking corner held a long vein of limestone beneath it that had been carrying water quietly for 1,000 years, waiting for someone patient enough to ask. Naomi never forgot the look on Pruitt's face, the slow unclenching of a man realizing that the very thing he had scorned was the thing that would save his farm. She did not know, crouched there in the Missouri dust with her chin on her knees, that she was watching a rehearsal for the whole of her own life still waiting ahead of her, nor could she have guessed how many years would pass and how much she would lose before the lesson would matter again. She was 19 when she met Thomas Colby, a rangy, soft-spoken cattleman passing through Missouri on his way back from a drive, who had stopped at her father's well to water his horse and stayed 3 days longer than his business required. Thomas did not have much beyond a good name, a small herd, and a piece of unproven land in Wyoming Territory that his own father had staked years before near a modest creek the family called Solace, for the comfort its clear water had given tired drovers. He asked Naomi to marry him with the plain honesty of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to offer in effort, and she said yes, not because he promised her comfort, but because he promised her a partnership. They married in the autumn of 1858 and rode west together, and for the better part of 3 decades they built something real out of raw prairie, a modest house, a barn raised board by board, a herd that grew slow and honest, A garden Naomi kept with the same patient attentiveness her father had once shown a dry hillside. She learned every fold of that land the way she had once learned to read a slope for water, and in the driest years, when other ranches lost half their stock, the Colby place always seemed to find just enough. Neighbors said Thomas had good luck. Naomi never corrected them, though she knew the truth was quieter than luck it was noticing. They had one son, Caleb, who died of fever at 4 years old, a wound neither of them ever spoke of again, but which both of them carried in the particular gentleness they afterward showed to every creature and every stranger who crossed their gate. Without more children to raise, Naomi poured herself into the land and into the town that had grown up loosely around the creek, Solace Creek, now boasting a mercantile, a small church, a schoolhouse, and just over 400 souls by the mid 1880s. She was known as a woman who could set a broken bone, deliver a breech calf, and speak sense into a frightened animal. And though she never sought attention, people came to her quietly, the way people always come to those who actually know things. It was, by every measure that mattered, a good life, built patiently, the way her father had taught her to find water, not by force, but by attention. Then came the years the old-timers still call the burning years, when the rains simply stopped, when the grass browned to paper and the creek that gave the town its name shrank to a trickle no wider than a plow furrow. Thomas, older now and stubborn as ever, worked himself past what his heart could carry, driving cattle to whatever water remained until one gray March morning in 1886 he did not rise from his bed at all. Naomi buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, beside the small stone that marked their son, and told herself that grief was simply another kind of drought to be weathered with patience. She might have weathered it too, had it not been for Silas Colby, Thomas's younger brother, a man who had spent most of his life in Cheyenne trading in land and debt rather than in cattle and labor, a man whose boots always stayed too clean for a man who claimed to love ranching, and who arrived at the ranch within a month of the funeral holding a paper Naomi had never seen before, a note, he said, that Thomas had signed years earlier against a loan for seed cattle, co-witnessed conveniently by men Silas knew well and Naomi did not. He stood in her own kitchen, turning his hat in his hands with an expression of manufactured sorrow, telling her that he took no pleasure in this, that business was business. And Naomi remembered thinking, with a clarity that surprised her even in her grief, that a man who truly took no pleasure in a thing did not usually arrive so quickly, so tidily prepared, so soon after a brother's grave had settled. Under territorial law, with no living children and a debt called due, the ranch could be and was seized to satisfy it. Naomi rode into town to consult the one lawyer Solace Creek possessed, a tired, honest man named Ezra Voss, whose office smelled always of pipe tobacco and old paper, and who examined the note for a long while under his spectacles, turning it toward the window light twice before sighing and setting it down as though it had grown heavy in his hands. He told her that whether the note was true or fabricated hardly mattered if she could not prove which, that the witnesses named upon it were men known to do favors for Silas in Cheyenne, and that fighting a Colby claim in a territorial court, with no money for filing fees and no allies willing to stand against a man who lent freely to half the county, was a fight she could not win before winter closed the passes. I am sorry, Naomi, he told her, and she believed that he meant it, which somehow made the injustice heavier rather than lighter to carry. Silas did not even have the decency to gloat. He simply informed her, with the flat courtesy of a man closing a transaction, that she had 1 month to vacate, and that he would be selling the herd, the tack, and most of the furnishings to settle what remained. Naomi Prather, she had begun privately to drop the name Colby the day she left that gate, walked away from 30 years of her own labor with a sack of clothes, her father's old dowsing switch, which she had kept all her life more from sentiment than use, her mother's cameo, and $41 that Thomas had, thank Providence, kept hidden in a coffee tin, rather than in any bank Silas could reach. She did not weep in front of the town, though she allowed herself one long night of it alone under the cottonwoods by the dry creek bed. And in the morning, she did what her father had always done when the ground seemed to offer nothing. She went looking anyway, patient and clear-eyed for whatever the world had overlooked. What the world had overlooked that particular season was 94 deer. Word had reached Solace Creek some weeks earlier that the Hargrove Game Preserve, a private hunting park some 20 miles north, established by a wealthy Eastern investor named Reginald Hargrove, who had fenced off several thousand acres to stock with imported and native deer for the amusement of his rich friends, had gone spectacularly bankrupt. Hargrove had fled back east owing wages, feed bills, and fencing debts to half the county, and the animals, a mixed herd of mule, deer, and whitetail, thin as fence frails, after a summer of neglect and drought-starved range inside their own enclosure, were considered worthless. The county auctioneer, a blustering man named Otis Dill, had tried to move the herd as venison on the hoof, but with the drought pressing every rancher's own stock to the bone, no one wanted 94 more mouths that produced neither milk, wool, nor labor. On the day of the auction, standing at the rail with her $41 and nowhere left to be, Naomi watched grown men laugh outright as Dill dropped his price from $3 a head to $1 for the lot, to finally, red-faced and disgusted, $18 for the entire starving herd. And somebody take the sorry things off my hands before I have to shoot them myself. Naomi raised her hand before she had quite finished thinking it through, and the laughter that rippled across that dusty yard followed her the rest of her life. A widow, with no land, no barn, no hay, buying 94 dying deer with money she needed for bread. Otis Dill himself asked her, not unkindly, what in creation she meant to do with them. Naomi only said what her father used to say when neighbors questioned a well he was sinking in unlikely ground: "I mean to see what they know that we don't." The 3-day drive itself was unlike anything Naomi had undertaken in her life, walking alone behind 94 gaunt, wild-eyed animals, with nothing but a stick, a canteen, and the strange, patient calm she had learned as a girl watching her father coax reluctant water from reluctant ground. The deer did not trust her. Not at first, shying from her shadow and bunching together at every strange sound, but by the second night, footsore and half-starved as she was herself, she noticed that a handful of the older does had stopped bolting at her approach, watching her instead with a wary, assessing stillness that reminded her, oddly, of the way widows sometimes looked at each other across a church aisle, recognizing something shared without needing it spoken. She slept those nights in the open, wrapped in her one blanket beneath a sky, so thick with stars it seemed almost another kind of drought, one of silence rather than water, and woke each dawn stiff and aching to find the herd had not scattered in the night but had drawn in closer around her smoldering fire, as though even starving animals understood there was some safety in numbers, and perhaps some safety in her. She had, in fact, one asset: Silas Colby's paper could not touch a homestead claim of 80 near worthless acres on the shoulder of Bittern Ridge that Thomas had filed on years before as a hunting camp, and mostly forgotten, too dry and too steep for grazing cattle, and therefore never worth including in any dispute. It was to this scrubby, overlooked patch of ground that Naomi drove her new and much mocked herd on foot over 3 exhausting days, sleeping under the stars beside animals too weak to run from her and oddly too weak to fear her either. She noted, the way her father had taught her to note everything, that even in their misery, the deer showed a peculiar restlessness each evening, turning their heads always toward the same high shoulder of rock on the ridge's northern face, ears up, nostrils working, long after they had bedded down everywhere else. Naomi assumed at first it was simple confusion, the aimless agitation of starving animals. She would soon learn it was the opposite of confusion. It was memory. On the 4th morning, after she settled the herd onto the ridgeland, with nothing left to feed them but what dry browse the slope itself offered, Naomi woke before dawn to find nearly the whole herd gathered at the base of a limestone outcrop she had always known simply as the Gray Shoulder, a jumble of pale rock jutting from the hillside that Thomas had once said was too broken and treacherous even to run a fence line across. The deer were not grazing there. They were licking the stone, nosing into a shadowed crevice at its base, pawing with a strange insistence at a patch of ground that Naomi realized with a small jolt was faintly, unmistakably damp, though no rain had fallen in 11 weeks. She knelt where they knelt. She put her bare hand flat against the stone the way her father had taught her to feel for a hillside's secrets, and she felt, beneath the morning's dry heat, a whisper of coolness rising from the crevice, carrying with it the mineral hush of underground water. She sat back on her heels in the gray dawn light, surrounded by 94 dying animals who had just done, without a single word spoken, exactly what her father had always sworn the thirsty could do better than any man with a willow switch. they had led her to water. It took her 2 more days of careful, patient work, widening the crevice by hand, clearing loose shale, listening the way her father had listened before she uncovered what was unmistakably the mouth of an old, deliberately built spring house. Its stone lintel, works by human hands decades before, nearly swallowed by rockfall and time. Behind the collapsed opening ran a clear, cold seep of water pooling into a shallow stone basin someone long ago had carved with evident care and purpose. The herd drank from her cupped hands and later from the basin itself until Naomi wept openly at the sight of it, not from relief alone, but from the strange, humbling wonder of having been led there by creatures the whole town had mocked her for saving. Inside the spring house, tucked into a dry recess above the water line, and sealed inside an oiled canvas wrapping that had somehow survived 3 decades of weather, Naomi found a battered tin dispatch box. Within it lay a hand-drawn survey map, brittle and foxed with age, and a leather-bound ledger belonging to a surveyor named Josiah Reamer, who, the flyleaf informed her, had platted the original town site of Solace Creek back in 1855, before Thomas's own father had ever staked a claim there. The map showed, in patient, careful ink, an underground spring system running the length of Bittern Ridge, feeding, according to Reamer's own careful notes, not only the small seep Naomi had uncovered, but the entire headwaters of Solace Creek itself, the very water that had given the town its name and its life. Reamer's ledger recorded in a surveyor's dry, exacting hand that he had deliberately built the spring house to protect what he called the town's true well, and had recommended, in a final entry dated the same year the town was platted, that the spring and its surrounding acreage be reserved permanently as common ground, belonging to no single rancher, so that Solace Creek could never be starved by drought nor held hostage by any one man's greed. For reasons the ledger did not explain, that recommendation had never been enacted. The land had instead passed through purchases and quiet arrangements Naomi did not yet understand into private hands, and the spring itself, sometime in the following decades, had been sealed deliberately by a rockfall that did not look, on closer inspection of drill marks still faintly visible in the stone, nearly as natural as it was meant to appear. She read Reamer's cramped, careful hand twice through before she trusted herself to stand, and when she finally emerged from the spring house into the pale morning light, the deer lifted their heads all together, as though they too had been waiting to see what she would make of what they had led her to. Naomi walked the length of the outcrop slowly, pressing her palm here and there against the warming stone, and found, low along the rock face where lichen had grown thick enough to disguise them from any casual glance, a series of drill holes, evenly spaced, the unmistakable pattern of a man-made blast rather than the random violence of a natural rockfall. Someone had brought down that shoulder of stone on purpose, and had done it carefully enough and long enough ago that moss and time had done the rest of the concealing for him. She sat with that discovery a long while in the cool hush of the spring house, her father's dowsing switch resting forgotten across her knees, and understood that she was holding not merely the answer to her own survival, but the answer to a wound the whole valley had been suffering without ever knowing its true cause. It did not take long for word to travel that the widow Prather had found water on Bittern Ridge, nor did it take Silas Colby long to arrive at her camp, dust still rising behind his horse, his face arranged in the particular alarm of a man who has just realized he sold off something more valuable than he understood. He was not, however, the only man with an interest in that spring. Close behind him rode Elias Vance, proprietor of the Solace Creek Water and Land Company, a smooth, unhurried man who had, over the preceding decade, quietly purchased the water rights to nearly every well and irrigation ditch in the valley, and who had, during the burning years, extended what he called neighborly credit to struggling ranchers against the collateral of their land credit that a great many of them, including Naomi, now understood with a cold clarity, Thomas himself had eventually been unable to repay. Vance informed her with unfailing politeness that the spring house and the surrounding ridge fell by an old and largely forgotten easement his company held under the Water and Land Company's rightful control, regardless of whose homestead claim the ground technically sat upon, and that he would be sending surveyors within the week to confirm the boundary. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Naomi recognized with the same patient clarity her father had taught her to read a hillside, that Vance was not merely claiming a spring. He was frightened of what Reamer's ledger might reveal about who had sealed it and why, and at whose convenient profit the town had gone thirsty for 30 years, while his company's reservoirs, fed by wells he alone controlled, had never once run dry. In the days between Vance's first visit and the town meeting that would finally settle the matter, Naomi found herself the subject of a peculiar new kind of talk in Solace Creek, one that mixed the old mockery with something warier, something almost afraid to hope. She rode to the mercantile for flour and heard two women fall, abruptly silent as she entered, then watched one of them, a shopkeeper's wife named Iris Dunmore, whose youngest Naomi had once nursed through scarlet fever, cross the room deliberately to press her hand and ask, in a low voice, whether it was true, whether there truly was water enough on that ridge to end the burning years for good. Naomi told her only what she knew for certain, and Iris carried that certainty back out into the street like a lit lamp, so that by evening half the town had heard some version of the story, embroidered variously with treasure, ghosts, and a dead surveyor's curse, none of which Naomi bothered to correct, since the plain truth she had learned generally survived its own telling better than people expected. The town, when Naomi finally rode in to lay the ledger before the same tired lawyer, Ezra Voss, who had once told her she could not win against Silas Colby, was slower to believe her than she had hoped. Solace Creek had spent a decade in Vance's careful debt, and men do not easily accuse the hand that has, however unevenly, kept them from ruin. Some neighbors, remembering the auction, remembering the laughter, said openly that the widow with the starving deer had finally taken leave of her senses entirely, chasing buried treasure and old surveyors' tales. Others, quieter, remembered how Naomi Prather had set their children's bones and pulled their calves and never once asked for payment, and were willing at least to come and see the spring house for themselves. Vance, sensing the tide might not run entirely his way, moved to have the matter settled quickly and privately, offering Naomi a sum for her homestead claim that would have been, to a woman with $41 to her name, an overwhelming fortune enough to leave the valley entirely and never look back. It was, Naomi understood, precisely the offer meant to make the whole matter disappear before Reamer's ledger and its drill-marked rockfall could be examined by anyone with the authority to ask uncomfortable questions. Vance made his offer standing at the very lip of the spring house, his voice pitched low and reasonable, the voice of a man accustomed to closing difficult matters quietly before they could grow teeth, and he reminded her, gently, that a widow alone had little to gain from a long fight against a company with lawyers in Cheyenne and friends on the territorial bench, and a great deal to gain from simply taking his money and beginning again somewhere kinder. For a moment, standing there with the cold spring water darkening the hem of her skirt and 94 deer watching from the slope above, Naomi allowed herself to imagine it a train ticket, a small house somewhere green, an end to all of it. Then she thought of Josiah Reamer's careful, patient hand recommending common ground 30 years before anyone had been ready to listen, and of her own father crouched on a scorned hillside, insisting that the ground talks first to the thirsty, and she found the imagining dissolved as quickly as it had come. She refused him in the spring house itself, kneeling beside the basin where her deer still drank each morning, and told Elias Vance, in the same plain voice her father had used with skeptical neighbors, that some things were never meant to belong to one person at all, and that she intended to see Josiah Reamer's original recommendation finally honored 30 years late. Vance's composure did not break, but something in his eyes did, and he left the ridge that evening with the unhurried, dangerous calm of a man recalculating. What followed was not a single dramatic reckoning, but a slow, patient unspooling, fitting for a story that had itself been built on patience. Ezra Voss, once he examined Reamer's surveyor ledger alongside the territory's original land office records, found that the recommendation for common ground had indeed been filed, and simply never recorded an oversight, or perhaps something less innocent, that predated Vance's own arrival in the valley, but which Vance had certainly profited from, and the drill marks strongly suggested had personally ensured remained sealed once he understood what lay beneath that rockfall. A hydrologist summoned from Cheyenne confirmed what the deer and then Naomi had already known that the Ridge Spring was the true headwater source fed by the same underground system that supplied Vance's own reservoirs, meaning the Water and Land Company had for years been selling the town its own water back at a price, um, while allowing the original common spring to remain buried and forgotten. At a town meeting held in the schoolhouse where Naomi herself had once helped tend sick children, Ezra Voss laid out the ledger, the survey, and the hydrologist's findings before a hall packed shoulder to shoulder with ranchers who had, every one of them, spent a decade paying Elias Vance for water that had never needed to be scarce at all. Naomi did not need to say very much. She simply stood, when asked, in the same plain wool dress she had worn to a dozen difficult mornings before this one, and told the packed schoolhouse what 94 starving, laughed at deer had taught a laughed at widow about where to look for what a town had lost. She spoke of her father's hillsides in Missouri, of the way a thirsty creature never lies about where water is, of the strange grace of being led somewhere by animals everyone had told her were worthless. She did not raise her voice against Elias Vance, who sat near the back of the room with his hat in his lap and his face arranged in careful stillness, and she did not need to, because Otis Dill himself, the very auctioneer who had once sold her the herd for $18 amid general laughter, stood unprompted from his bench and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, that he had never in his life seen a fool's bargain turn into the soundest investment a person could make, and that if the widow Prather was a fool, he hoped the whole territory bred more like her. The Territorial Land Office, presented with Reamer's original filing and the town's unified petition, moved with unusual speed to restore Bittern Ridge and its spring to common ground at last, honoring a recommendation 30 years overdue. Elias Vance, facing both the exposure of his company's dealings and a wave of ranchers now unwilling to pay for water that flowed freely on common land, quietly sold his remaining holdings within the year and left the valley altogether, his departure noted by the townsfolk not with triumph but with the same tired relief one feels when a long drought finally breaks. Silas Colby, whose original claim against Thomas's estate came under fresh scrutiny once Ezra Voss began asking pointed questions about co-witnesses and convenient timing, found it prudent to relinquish the ranch back to Naomi rather than risk the note being examined too closely in open court, and by the following spring, Naomi Prather stood once more on the porch of the home she and Thomas had built, listening to water running clean and unbothered down from Bittern Ridge into the creek that had given the town its name and, at long last, its life again. In the weeks it took the Territorial Land Office to act on Reamer's long-buried recommendation, Naomi returned each morning to the ridge to sit a while among the herd, watching them grow steadier and fuller-bodied as the weeks passed, their winter coats coming in glossy where once they had been dull and patchy with hunger, and she found in that slow, visible mending a comfort she had not expected, as though the land itself were healing on the same unhurried schedule as everything else worth healing. She did not, in the end, keep the spring for herself, any more than Josiah Reamer had ever intended it to belong to one man's ledger of profit. The town built a proper stone cistern at the spring house mouth that year, and a public trough beside the schoolhouse fed by the same water, and it became something of a quiet local custom in the years that followed for children to be taken up to Bittern Ridge each spring to see the deer for Naomi kept the herd, gentled and fattened now, grazing the common ground alongside the very spring they had found, and to hear from whichever elder happened to be walking with them the story of the widow who bought 94 starving, worthless animals because she had learned long before anyone in Solace Creek ever needed to know it that the ground talks first to the thirsty and that patience is not the virtue of the weak, but the discipline of the clear-eyed. At 48 years old, Naomi Prather had stood at the edge of a dirt road with nothing but a flour sack and $41, cast out by a brother-in-law's greed and a town's quiet indifference, and had done the one foolish, laughable thing that no one else believed was worth doing. She had looked at what everyone else had already written off, 94 dying deer nobody wanted at any price, and had chosen, out of nothing more than her father's old patient habit of noticing, to see whether the overlooked might still be carrying something of worth inside it. It was never really about the deer, and it was never really about the water alone. It was about a woman who had been told, in every way a hard world knows how to tell a person, that she and everything she touched were worthless, and who proved, with the same quiet clarity her father had once shown a dry Missouri hillside. That value does not vanish simply because the loud and the hurried have stopped looking for it. Solace Creek remembered her in the end, not as the fool who bought the starving deer, but as the woman who listened when everyone else had already decided there was nothing left to hear. Thank you for spending this time with Naomi's story and with us. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you would share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the overlooked can still hold everything worth finding. Before you go, we would love to know, what is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us below. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.